The day began like any other in the small town of Briarwood. The morning sunlight filtered through the narrow windows of the Cornerstone Cafe, casting a soft glow on the patrons already seated at their tables, sipping coffee and sharing quiet conversations. Behind the counter, Sarah Matthews moved swiftly, balancing a tray of freshly brewed coffee pots and warm pastries. With her short crop hair pulled back neatly and a simple apron tied around her waist, Sarah blended into the scene effortlessly. She was a fixture in this cafe, just as much as the chipped tables and creaky wooden floorboards. Sarah's life was predictable, maybe even a little monotonous, but she found comfort in that predictability. At 47, she had resigned herself to a quiet life, one where the most excitement she'd see was a bustling morning rush or a new item added to the menu. Briarwood was her safe haven, a small, close-knit town where everyone knew everyone, and change came at a snail's pace. But it was a town where her voice, one she barely used beyond greeting customers and talking to her teenage daughter, remained unnoticed, lost in the hum of daily life. Sarah's voice had once been the center of her world. Years ago, in her youth, she dreamt of becoming a singer. She had a voice that could hold a room in rapt attention, one that, when given the chance, could express feelings even she found hard to articulate. But life had happened, as it often does. Her family had frowned upon her aspirations, insisting she focus on practical matters instead of frivolous dreams. So she had tucked away that part of herself, folded it neatly, and placed it on the highest shelf in her mind, where it gathered dust and was nearly forgotten. That morning at the cafe, however, something shifted. Just as Sarah was about to take a customer's order, she overheard a conversation at the neighboring table. The cafe owner, Tom, was enthusiastically explaining his plans for the upcoming town charity event. Tom, an energetic man with an unquenchable passion for community projects, was gathering volunteers to perform at a talent showcase to raise funds for a new community center. As he spoke, Sarah felt a curious pull in her chest, a sensation she hadn't felt in years. Her heart beat a little faster as she caught herself wondering what it would be like to stand up there on that stage, singing her heart out. But before she could entertain the thought, she felt a familiar wave of self-doubt wash over her. She pushed the notion aside, telling herself that was a part of her life that no longer existed. She was just Sarah, the cafe waitress, not Sarah, the singer. Just then, Lily, her closest friend and coworker, appeared by her side, having caught the glint of something in Sarah's eyes. "You should do it, you know," Lily said with a knowing smile. Sarah laughed it off, waving her friend's suggestion away, but Lily was persistent, nudging her gently. "It's a chance to be heard, Sarah. When's the last time you sang for anyone but yourself?" The question lingered in Sarah's mind, tugging at a part of her she thought she'd buried. As she left the cafe that afternoon, she found herself humming a tune from her youth, the melody both comforting and bittersweet. At home, Sarah's daughter, Emma, sat at the dining table, her face buried in her phone. When Sarah mentioned the charity event, Emma barely looked up, muttering something about how weird it would be if her mom performed in front of the whole town. Her daughter's dismissive tone stung more than she cared to admit, but it also sparked a quiet defiance within her. She wondered if Emma, or anyone else for that matter, really knew who she was beneath the surface. That night, in the quiet of her small bedroom, Sarah retrieved an old notebook from the back of her closet. Its pages were filled with song lyrics she had written years ago, each line a piece of her younger self, a self that had dared to dream. As she read through them, memories flooded back, memories of a time when she believed in her own voice, when she believed it was strong enough to make others feel something. She hesitated, feeling the weight of her doubts pressing down, but there was a tiny flicker of courage, a spark she hadn't felt in years. The next day, after another long shift at the cafe, Sarah found herself making her way to the community center, where Tom was holding auditions for the charity event. Her hands were trembling, and she questioned every step she took, wondering what in the world had possessed her to do this. But something deep inside her urged her forward. The sight of the empty stage filled her with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. As Tom greeted her, his enthusiasm infectious, Sarah felt a surge of nerves. He handed her a microphone, and for a moment, she froze, feeling as though every eye in the room was on her, waiting. Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes and let the music within her rise. Her voice started out soft, almost tentative, but as she continued, it grew stronger, filling the room with a sound that seemed to carry years of unspoken words and buried dreams. She sang a song she'd written herself, a melody that spoke of resilience, of dreams deferred but not forgotten. Tom, along with a few onlookers, watched in awe as her voice unfolded, raw and full of emotion. When she finished, there was a brief, stunned silence before a soft ripple of applause broke out, and Tom approached her with a look of astonishment. Sarah left the community center that day feeling lighter, as if a weight she had carried for years had lifted. But the real surprise came later that night when her phone buzzed with a message from Tom. Unbeknownst to her, someone had recorded her performance and shared it on social media, and it had started to gain attention from people all over town. The comments were filled with words of admiration, shock, and encouragement. For the first time, people saw her, really saw her, not just as the quiet waitress, but as someone with a story to tell, a voice to share. But with this newfound recognition came a sense of unease. Sarah knew that performing again in front of the entire town, in front of friends, neighbors, and even her own daughter, would be a challenge. She'd spent so many years hiding this part of herself, and now she was about to lay it bare. Emma, however, remained indifferent, shrugging off her mom's performance with a teenage aloofness that left Sarah questioning herself once again. Despite the doubt gnawing at her, something inside Sarah had awakened, and it refused to be silenced. She knew that stepping back now would be a betrayal of that part of her she had only just rediscovered. The charity event was fast approaching, and Sarah found herself rehearsing every night after work, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. She knew that the stage could be her last chance to prove to herself, and perhaps to her daughter, that her voice mattered, that she mattered. In the days leading up to the event, Sarah encountered encouraging faces at the cafe, people she barely knew who came up to her and told her how much they looked forward to seeing her perform. Some shared their own stories, talking about dreams they had set aside, sacrifices they had made, and how they wished they could reclaim parts of themselves they had let go of long ago. She realized her story wasn't hers alone. It was a piece of a larger tapestry, one woven from the dreams and regrets of so many others. When the day of the charity event finally arrived, Sarah stood backstage, her heart pounding as she prepared to step into the spotlight. The familiar faces in the audience, the murmur of anticipation, and the realization of what this moment meant filled her with a nervous excitement she hadn't felt in decades. As she waited for her name to be called, she took one last deep breath, knowing that this moment, this song, could change everything, not just for her but perhaps for the whole town of Briarwood. And as she took those final steps onto the stage, Sarah couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something far greater than she had ever imagined. As the days ticked by, Sarah found herself oscillating between excitement and dread. Each night, after her shifts at the cafe, she retreated to her bedroom, standing before her old full-length mirror, microphone in hand, practicing in hushed tones so as not to disturb Emma. The words of her song, one she had written years ago during her youth, floated around her room like echoes from another lifetime. She wondered if they still held the same power, if they could resonate not only with her but also with the people who had known her for years but never truly seen her. Though Sarah practiced in secret, there was no hiding the small changes that crept into her demeanor during the day. Lily noticed first, sensing the barely restrained energy in Sarah's movements as she went about her work at the cafe. Lily's supportive smiles and occasional winks boosted Sarah's confidence, even as others continued to see her as just the quiet woman behind the counter. Sarah overheard snippets of conversations from patrons discussing the charity event, speculating on who might be performing. She even heard one customer, a man she served coffee to every morning, say dismissively, "I doubt anyone really surprising will show up, just the usual lot." Those words stung, even though she tried to brush them off. How many people had looked at her, day in and day out, and never imagined she was capable of something more. But beyond the cafe, there was her daughter, Emma. Sarah couldn't deny the distance that had crept between them over the years. Emma was wrapped up in her world of high school drama, her social media, and her friends. At 16, she seemed to see her mother as nothing more than an embarrassing relic of an older, uninteresting time. When Sarah had tried to broach the subject of her upcoming performance, Emma had barely glanced up from her phone, a look of mild horror flashing across her face as she muttered something about how weird it was. Her daughter's indifference cut deeper than any patron's dismissive words. Yet there were moments when Sarah caught a flicker of something softer in Emma's gaze. It was as if, somewhere beneath her teenage disdain, there was a lingering curiosity about this new side of her mother. Sarah clung to the hope that perhaps her performance might bridge the growing gulf between them, even if Emma was too stubborn to admit it. Then there was the matter of choosing her song. The lyrics she had written felt raw, unpolished. Each word was like a fragment of her past self, a self she had tried to forget. She spent hours adjusting the melody, tweaking the words to fit her current life, a woman who had tasted regret, sacrifice, and quiet resilience. She knew that this song was more than just notes on a page. It was a story of her own, one she had kept hidden for so long that even she was surprised by its intensity. One evening, she sat alone in her small kitchen, lyrics scattered across the table like pieces of a puzzle she was trying to assemble. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, and to her surprise, it was a message from Lily. "Sarah," it read, "there's someone I think you should meet." The next day, Lily introduced Sarah to an elderly man named Mr. Evans, a musician who had retired to Briarwood years ago. He was a man with a past, a former guitarist who had traveled the world with a band in his youth, only to give it all up to settle down and lead a quiet life. As they sat together at the cafe, Mr. Evans spoke of the allure and heartbreak of dreams, of how life had a way of twisting even the most carefully laid plans. His words resonated deeply with Sarah, striking a chord she hadn't realized was there. "I heard about your performance," he said with a kind smile, his eyes twinkling with a wisdom born from years of experience. "And I've been told you have quite the voice." Sarah blushed, feeling a familiar wave of shyness wash over her. She had never been good at accepting praise, especially from someone as accomplished as Mr. Evans. "Thank you," she murmured. "But I don't know if I'm really that good. I mean, it's been so long since I sang in front of anyone." Mr. Evans chuckled, leaning in closer. "Let me tell you something, Sarah. Talent doesn't disappear with age. It only deepens. You have something to say, don't you? Something you've been holding on to all these years." Sarah nodded slowly, feeling a lump rise in her throat. For the first time, someone had put into words what she hadn't dared to admit, even to herself. Mr. Evans offered to help her, suggesting they practice together. In the evenings, after her shifts, Sarah met him in the small community hall where he kept his guitar. Together, they worked on her song, his steady guidance calming her nerves as he coaxed her voice out of its shell. Mr. Evans's presence was reassuring, like an anchor that kept her grounded even as her emotions began to swell. He reminded her that every word she sang was her truth, and that was all that mattered. Yet, despite the support she found in Mr. Evans and Lily, a shadow of doubt lingered. Sarah's daughter continued to ignore her efforts, and she overheard Emma on the phone, laughing with a friend about her mother's upcoming performance, calling it a midlife crisis in a mocking tone that stung. But rather than discourage her, Emma's words fueled a quiet fire within her. If nothing else, Sarah wanted to show her daughter that age didn't define dreams, that it was never too late to reclaim the pieces of oneself that had been lost along the way. The night before the charity event, Sarah lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was a whirl of fears and hopes, the two locked in a relentless battle. She thought about the audience she would face, People she saw every day. People who had formed silent judgments about her. People who had pigeonholed her into a role she hadn't chosen. But above all, she thought about her daughter, and a part of her ached with a fierce longing for Emma to understand, to see her not just as her mother, but as a person with her own. As the applause washed over her, Sarah felt an overwhelming surge of relief, mixed with exhilaration. She hadn't imagined the kind of response she received. Faces she had known for years looked at her with expressions of wonder, admiration, and even a few with tears glistening in their eyes. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't bring herself to step off the stage, as if this was a moment she needed to hold on to burn into her memory forever. She searched the crowd for her daughter, Emma, and saw her sitting toward the back, her mouth slightly open, a mixture of shock and something else, something Sarah hoped might be pride, in her expression. But as quickly as the moment had begun, it ended. The lights dimmed, and Sarah stepped off the stage, her legs trembling from a mix of nerves and adrenaline. Lily was the first to meet her, wrapping her in a fierce hug and whispering, "You were amazing, Sarah. Absolutely amazing." Sarah could barely process the words. Everything felt like a blur, as if she were floating above herself, watching the evening unfold from a distance. More people came up to her, friends and strangers alike, each one showering her with words of praise. They spoke of how moved they were, of how her voice had reached into their hearts. A few of the older women held her hands, telling her stories of their own buried dreams, lives filled with sacrifices they had made for their families. Each story was a piece of something larger, a silent chorus of lives spent in quiet self-denial, each woman hoping to reclaim a little piece of themselves, if only in the listening. Sarah was astonished. She had spent so much of her life thinking that her voice was something small, something unworthy of attention. Now, standing among these people, she realized it was quite the opposite. Her voice had been a spark, one that had touched a hidden chord within the community. After a while, the crowd began to thin, and the event wound down. Emma had stayed near the back, avoiding the crowd that surrounded her mother. Sarah saw her standing alone, glancing down at her phone, her shoulders drawn up as if she were trying to disappear. With a slight pang, Sarah approached her, taking slow steps so as not to startle her. When she reached her daughter, Emma looked up, her expression unreadable. For a moment, they stood in silence, both unsure of what to say. Finally, Sarah broke the quiet. "So, what did you think?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Emma looked away, fidgeting with her phone. "It was different," she said after a pause, her tone clipped, though there was something fragile beneath her words, a hesitation Sarah hadn't expected. Sarah nodded, choosing her words carefully. "I know it might have been strange to see me up there, but I wanted you to know that I used to love singing. I still do. And tonight, it meant a lot to me." Emma's face softened slightly, but her guard was still up. "Yeah, I get it. I didn't know you could sing like that," she admitted, her voice tinged with a reluctant admiration. "I mean, I thought you were just, you." Sarah managed a small smile, recognizing the complexity behind her daughter's words. "I am just me," she replied gently, "but sometimes there's more to people than what we see. Sometimes they have dreams and parts of themselves that get hidden away." Emma shifted uncomfortably, looking down at her feet. "Maybe. I don't know. I guess it was cool," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. Sarah sensed the vulnerability beneath her daughter's teenage bravado and decided not to press further. She felt a glimmer of hope that maybe over time, Emma would come to understand that her mother was more than just a fixture in her life, that she had dreams and feelings as complex as Emma's own. As they drove home that night, Sarah replayed her performance in her mind, feeling an inexplicable mixture of joy and sadness. She knew the moment had been transformative, but the path ahead felt uncertain. The attention she had received was exhilarating, but it also left her feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't anticipated. The days following the event brought a surprising turn of events. Her performance had been recorded by one of the attendees and shared online, quickly spreading through social media channels. The video, titled simply "Woman Sings Heart Out in Small Town Talent Show," had gone viral within the community and beyond. It was shared, commented on, and even picked up by a few local news outlets. Sarah's phone buzzed with notifications, messages of encouragement from people she hadn't heard from in years, and comments from strangers who said they were moved by her voice, by the raw emotion she conveyed. People who had once only nodded politely at her in the cafe now stopped by to share their thoughts, to ask if she'd be performing again. She found herself bombarded with questions. Did she have more songs? Would she record an album? And most surprisingly, a local music producer reached out, inviting her to consider recording the song professionally. It was as if a floodgate had opened, and suddenly Sarah's life, once so steady and predictable, was swept up in a whirlwind of possibilities she had never dreamed of. But with the excitement came fear. She felt torn, pulled between the quiet life she had always known and the thrilling yet terrifying unknown that now beckoned her. The offer from the producer lingered in her mind, both enticing and intimidating. It wasn't just a question of recording a song. It was a question of stepping into a life she had once thought was lost to her. The thought of leaving Briarwood, even if only for a short time, filled her with anxiety. This was her home, her comfort zone, the place where she had built her life. And there was Emma to consider, her daughter, who was still grappling with her own view of her mother and her own struggles with fitting in. One evening, after a long shift at the cafe, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, lost in thought. Emma entered, glancing at her mother with a curious expression. "Are you going to do it?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Sarah looked up, surprised. "Do what?" Emma rolled her eyes, but there was a hint of genuine interest beneath her typical teenage exasperation. "The recording thing. The producer. Are you going to go for it?" Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know, Emma. It's a big step. I'd have to leave for a while. And there's a lot to think about." Emma crossed her arms, leaning against the doorway. "I mean, you're always telling me to try new things, right? To not be afraid to go after what I want." Her voice softened, and for the first time, Sarah sensed a hint of respect in her daughter's words. Maybe you should take your own advice." Sarah's heart swelled at Emma's words. She hadn't realized how much she had wanted her daughter's approval, how much it mattered to her. And here it was, in Emma's hesitant encouragement, a small but unmistakable show of support. It was the push she needed. The following week, Sarah made arrangements with the producer to record her song. She left Briarwood for the first time in years, the journey both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. In the recording studio, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and high-tech equipment, Sarah felt out of place, an ordinary woman standing in a space where dreams were captured and turned into reality. Yet as she stepped up to the microphone, closed her eyes, and began to sing, she felt the familiar comfort of her voice wrapping around her like a warm embrace. She sang with the same raw emotion she had at the charity event, allowing herself to be vulnerable, to be seen. When the recording session ended, the producer approached her, his eyes filled with admiration. "That was incredible, Sarah. You have a gift that people need to hear." As she drove back to Briarwood, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm. She knew that whatever happened, she had done something meaningful, not just for herself but for others. She had reclaimed a part of herself that she thought was lost forever. And in doing so, she had inspired others to do the same. She had found her voice, and in a way, she had found herself. Back in Briarwood, the recording quickly gained popularity, and people from all walks of life reached out, sharing how her song had touched them, how it had reminded them of their own lost dreams. The song became a sort of anthem, a symbol of resilience and hope, resonating with people far beyond her small town. Briarwood was transformed, too, the townspeople taking pride in Sarah's accomplishment, inspired to pursue their own passions. And in the midst of it all, Emma's attitude toward her mother shifted. She began to see Sarah as more than just her mom, more than just a woman who poured coffee at a cafe. She saw her as a person who had fought to reclaim her dreams, who had taken a risk despite the odds. Their relationship, once marked by distance and misunderstanding, began to mend, slowly but surely, as Emma learned to appreciate the strength and courage her mother had shown. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, Emma turned to Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "Mom, I'm proud of you," she said quietly, her voice laced with sincerity. Sarah looked at her daughter, her heart full. "Thank you, Emma," she whispered, feeling a tear slip down her cheek. In that moment, she knew that dreams and struggles. As dawn broke, Sarah found herself walking through the quiet streets of Briarwood, the cool morning air calming her racing thoughts. She passed by familiar landmarks: the library, the small park, the elementary school where Emma had once played. Each building held memories, fragments of her life that seemed to fold into the lyrics she would soon sing. She felt a strange sense of peace, as if the town itself was offering her a quiet encouragement, reminding her that she was as much a part of it as the cobbled streets and old oak trees. Finally, the day arrived. Sarah stepped into the community center, her heart pounding in her chest as she took in the stage, illuminated by the soft glow of the lights above. She could hear the hum of the audience gathering, their voices blending into a symphony of anticipation. Her hands were clammy, her breath uneven, but beneath her fear was a quiet resolve, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Mr. Evans was there, waiting with his guitar, his presence a reassuring reminder of the journey that had led her here. He gave her a gentle nod, as if to say, "You're ready." And in that moment, Sarah knew he was right. As she stood backstage, waiting for her name to be called, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought of Emma, of her mother's disapproving words from years ago, of every quiet moment she had spent denying herself the one thing she loved. This was her chance to reclaim that love, to let her voice echo through the room, and perhaps through the lives of those who heard it. When the announcer called her name, Sarah stepped onto the stage, the spotlight illuminating her face as a hush fell over the crowd. She scanned the audience, her gaze landing briefly on Emma, who sat in the back, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and reluctant curiosity. In the days following her return to Briarwood, Sarah found herself in a world that felt both familiar and utterly changed. She resumed her shifts at the cafe, greeting the regulars, serving coffee, and handling orders, but she sensed that she was different, and the people around her sensed it too. Customers looked at her with newfound respect, some of them even a little awestruck, as if they were only now realizing who she truly was. Though Briarwood was still the same small, quiet town, Sarah's presence now stirred a ripple of inspiration among its people. As word spread of her recorded song, which had taken off on social media, Sarah became a kind of local celebrity. Her face appeared in the town's newsletter and even in a couple of nearby city newspapers. People came from neighboring towns, curious to meet the woman whose voice had touched so many. Some even approached her at the cafe, telling her how her song had encouraged them to revisit dreams they had long abandoned. For Sarah, it was both heartwarming and overwhelming to realize the depth of her impact. One evening, as Sarah walked home from work, she noticed something unexpected. There was a small crowd gathered in the town square, clustered around a young woman who was reading a poem aloud. Sarah recognized her. It was Grace, the shy girl who worked at the grocery store, always too nervous to speak more than a few words at a time. Yet here she was, standing confidently, sharing her words with a group of townsfolk who listened with quiet attentiveness. When she finished, the crowd broke into applause, and Sarah saw Grace blush, looking both surprised and delighted. As Sarah approached, Grace caught her eye and smiled. "Thank you, Sarah," she said softly, as the crowd dispersed. "For what?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. "For showing us that it's okay to share what's in our hearts," Grace replied, her voice trembling slightly. I've always wanted to write, to read my poetry, but I was too scared. Until I heard your song. You gave me the courage to try." Sarah felt a wave of emotion rise within her. It was humbling to realize that her small act of reclaiming her voice had sparked a quiet revolution in others. She hugged Grace and offered words of encouragement, marveling at how her own courage had somehow planted seeds in the hearts of people she barely knew. But as much as Briarwood embraced Sarah's transformation, her own home still carried a lingering unease. Emma, though she had softened toward her mother, still struggled with her mixed emotions. She had seen the video of Sarah's song spreading across social media, watched people fawn over her mother in a way that was both thrilling and confusing. Though she was proud of Sarah, she also found herself wrestling with jealousy, fear, and insecurity, emotions she couldn't yet name or understand. One evening, Emma came home late, her mood sullen, and her face flushed with frustration. She walked past Sarah in the hallway without a word, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Emma," Sarah called gently, sensing something was wrong. She approached her daughter's room and knocked softly, waiting for a response. After a long silence, Emma opened the door, her expression guarded. "What?" she asked, her voice heavy with exasperation. "Is everything okay?" Sarah asked, her tone calm and patient. Emma hesitated, her jaw tight, and then she sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "It's just, everyone's talking about you, Mom. People at school, even my friends' parents. It's like you're suddenly this big deal. And I don't know, it just feels weird." Sarah felt a pang of sympathy. She realized how hard this must be for Emma, who was used to seeing her mother in a certain light, a safe, predictable role that now seemed to be shifting before her eyes. "I can understand why that might feel strange," Sarah said softly. "Everything has changed so quickly, and I never meant for any of this to affect you like this." Emma crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on the floor. "It's not just that. I guess, I always thought you were just my mom. Like, I didn't think you had anything special. And now everyone else is seeing something I didn't see. It's like I don't even know who you are." Sarah swallowed, feeling a lump in her throat. "Emma, I'm still the same person. I'm still your mom. But there was a part of me that I buried for a long time, and I didn't even realize how much it hurt to keep it hidden. I didn't do this to change who I am, or to become someone new. I did it because I wanted to show you, and myself, that it's never too late to be true to yourself." Emma's face softened, but her expression remained conflicted. It's hard to explain. I guess I feel like everyone sees you as this amazing person now. And I'm still just me. I don't have some special talent or anything. I'm just ordinary." In that moment, Sarah understood that Emma's struggle wasn't just about her mother's transformation. It was about her own insecurities, her own fear of not being enough. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Emma, you don't have to be extraordinary to be important. You have a voice, a unique perspective, and a heart that's big and kind. You may not see it now, but you're extraordinary in ways that have nothing to do with fame or recognition." Emma looked at her mother, her eyes glistening. "You really believe that?" Sarah smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. "Absolutely. You're my daughter, and that makes you remarkable in my eyes." Emma's face broke into a small, reluctant smile, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a sense of closeness between them, a fragile bridge that had been missing for too long. She hugged Emma, holding her close, and felt a deep sense of relief. Maybe the journey she was on wasn't just about reclaiming her own voice. Maybe it was also about helping Emma find hers. In the following days, Sarah continued to receive invitations to perform at local events, as well as messages from strangers who shared their own stories of lost dreams and reclaimed passions. But despite the attention and opportunities, she found herself drawn back to the quiet moments, to the conversations she had with Emma, who was gradually opening up, sharing more of her thoughts and fears. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emma turned to her mother with a thoughtful expression. "Mom, do you think I could try singing sometime? Not like you, but I don't know, just for fun." Sarah's heart swelled with pride and joy. "Of course, sweetheart. I'd love that," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. From that moment, singing became something they shared. They would sing together in the kitchen, their voices blending as they laughed and experimented with harmonies. For Sarah, these moments were gifts beyond measure, a way to bond with her daughter in a language that had always felt like her own. Meanwhile, the town continued to change. Inspired by Sarah's courage, others began to step forward, sharing their hidden talents and stories. A retired schoolteacher started painting again and held a small exhibit in the community hall. A local mechanic, who had once been a talented pianist, began performing at the cafe on Friday nights. The once quiet town of Briarwood seemed to blossom with creativity, each person inspired by the other's bravery. But perhaps the most surprising change was in Emma. Her initial discomfort with her mother's newfound fame had gradually transformed into a quiet admiration, and she even took part in a small talent show organized at her school. Though she was nervous, she sang a short song with confidence, and afterward, she admitted to Sarah that it had felt good to put herself out there, even if only for a few moments. One night, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah sat alone on the porch, reflecting on the journey she had taken. She realized that her decision to sing at the charity event had rippled through the lives of others, creating a tapestry of reclaimed dreams, renewed courage, and closer bonds. She had done something she had once thought impossible. Not only had she changed her own life, but she had touched the lives of those around her, inspiring them to believe in themselves, to see their worth. Sarah thought of all the messages she had received, the strangers who had shared their own stories of hidden passions and abandoned dreams. And she thought of Briarwood, a town that had once felt so small, so ordinary, but had transformed into a place filled with life, color, and a newfound sense of purpose. Her own story had woven into the larger story of the town, connecting people in ways she never could have imagined. As she sat there, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she had helped others find theirs. The journey hadn't been easy. It had been filled with doubts, insecurities, and unexpected challenges, but it had been worth it. And as the night settled over Briarwood, Sarah closed her eyes, her heart full. She was no longer just the woman behind the counter at the cafe. She was a singer, a dreamer, a mother, and a friend. And she knew that her story, her voice, would continue to resonate in the lives of those around her for years to come. As the months passed, the impact of Sarah's journey continued to ripple through Briarwood, leaving a lasting mark on the town and its people. What had begun as a single vulnerable performance had transformed not only Sarah's life, but had awakened a spark of creativity and courage in everyone around her. The quiet town, once subdued by routine and predictability, had taken on a new vibrancy, as if every person had found their own small way of reclaiming a part of themselves they had almost forgotten. With her song gaining traction and reaching even further through online sharing, Sarah was approached by a local arts organization to participate in a community initiative. They wanted her to lead a program that encouraged people of all ages to embrace their hidden talents and tell their stories through creative expression. It was an unexpected turn in Sarah's life, a new role that felt both exciting and daunting. At first, she hesitated. She wasn't a professional musician or a trained teacher. She was simply a woman who had dared to sing her truth. What could she possibly teach others? But her conversations with Lily and Mr. Evans, who had become two of her greatest supporters, helped her realize that it wasn't about credentials or expertise. It was about showing up with authenticity, about offering others the same encouragement she had needed to find her voice. With a deep breath, she agreed to take on the project. They called it Voices of Briarwood, a community series of workshops and gatherings where people could share their talents, whether it was singing, poetry, painting, storytelling, or even simply talking about dreams they hadn't yet pursued. The goal was to create a safe space, a space where people felt seen and heard, where they could break free from the roles and limitations that life had placed upon them. The first workshop was held in the community center, and as Sarah stood in front of the room, her heart pounded with nerves. She looked out at the small crowd that had gathered. Some were familiar faces from the cafe. Others were strangers who had come from neighboring towns after hearing about her story. There were young people, seniors, and even a few families who had come together, each person carrying with them their own silent hopes and forgotten dreams. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the surge of courage rise within her. She began by telling her story again, this time in more detail. She spoke of the fear, the doubt, and the years she had spent hiding her voice. She admitted to the insecurity she had felt standing on that stage for the first time, the fear of being judged, the worry that people would see her and think, "Who does she think she is?" But she also shared the profound sense of liberation she had felt when she finally allowed herself to be seen, when she sang not just for others, but for herself. When she finished, there was a quiet, reflective stillness in the room. Then, one by one, people began to open up. A middle-aged man named Tom, who had worked in the town's post office for nearly 2 decades, revealed that he had once dreamed of being a painter. He had never pursued it, believing it to be impractical, but as he shared his story, Sarah could see a glint of longing in his eyes. An elderly woman named Evelyn stood up next, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a piece of paper. She explained that she had always wanted to write poetry, but had never shown her work to anyone. Her voice quivered as she read a short poem she had written about lost love, and by the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Over the next few weeks, Voices of Briarwood became a gathering that people looked forward to, a rare chance to break free from the daily grind and immerse themselves in something deeply personal. Each week brought new faces and new stories. People who had once hidden their passions began to express themselves openly. And the magic of it all was that Sarah didn't need to teach or instruct. All she had to do was listen, to hold space for others as they found their voices. One evening, after a particularly moving session, Sarah found herself standing outside the community center with Mr. Evans, who had joined her as a co-facilitator for the project. The older man had become a trusted friend, a quiet presence who provided both encouragement and gentle wisdom. They looked up at the night sky, the stars twinkling against the deep blue. "You know, Sarah," Mr. Evans said, his voice filled with admiration, "what you've done here, it's something extraordinary. You've given people a gift they didn't know they needed." Sarah smiled, though she still felt a sense of disbelief at the impact of her journey. "I don't know," she replied. "Sometimes I feel like I just stumbled into this. All I wanted was to sing, to have one moment to feel like I was more than just ordinary." Mr. Evans chuckled, a knowing look in his eyes. "Maybe so, but maybe that's what makes it so powerful. You didn't set out to change lives. You set out to be true to yourself. And by doing that, you reminded everyone else that they have that same power." The words resonated deeply with Sarah, and as she looked around at the town she had known her whole life, she saw it with fresh eyes. Briarwood was no longer just a small town where people came to settle down. It was a place where people were beginning to come alive, to find meaning in the everyday. People were no longer hiding their passions or dreams. They were sharing them, living them, and in doing so, they were transforming not only themselves but each other. As the program continued, Sarah's relationship with Emma began to heal in unexpected ways. Inspired by her mother's courage and the honesty of those who shared their stories, Emma started to open up as well, talking about her own struggles at school, the pressures of fitting in, and the uncertainty she felt about her future. Sarah listened, offering her daughter the same patience and understanding she had received from others. The walls between them, once fortified by misunderstanding and distance, began to crumble. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, Emma asked, "Mom, do you think I'll ever find something I'm good at, like you did?" Sarah looked at her daughter, her heart full of love and empathy. "Emma, you have so much time to discover what makes you happy. You don't need to have it all figured out right now. Just follow your curiosity, and don't be afraid to try new things. The rest will come in its own time." Emma nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Do you think maybe I could come with you to the workshop sometime?" The question filled Sarah with a quiet joy. "Of course, sweetheart," she replied, her voice soft with gratitude. "I'd love that." That weekend, Emma joined her at the community center, sitting quietly in the back, observing the courage of those who stood up to share their stories. By the end of the session, Emma's eyes were wide with awe, and she seemed to have a new appreciation for the people of Briarwood, who were no longer just neighbors and acquaintances, but individuals with rich, complex lives. Sarah could see the wheels turning in her daughter's mind, the slow realization that she was part of a community that was more than just a collection of houses and streets. It was a place filled with dreams, struggles, and triumphs, a place where each person had something to offer. Over time, Sarah noticed changes in Emma. Her daughter's confidence began to grow, and she took on new challenges at school with a sense of purpose she hadn't shown before. She even joined the school choir, surprising Sarah with a solo performance that left her both proud and emotional. Watching Emma sing reminded Sarah of her own journey, of the courage it took to step out of the shadows and let her voice be heard. She realized that Emma was finding her own path, her own voice, and it filled her with a quiet satisfaction. As the program continued, Voices of Briarwood became more than just a workshop. It evolved into a community movement. People began hosting open mic nights, art exhibitions, and even small theater performances, each event an opportunity for individuals to share their talents and celebrate each other's courage. The town's atmosphere shifted, becoming one of mutual support and shared pride. Briarwood was no longer the sleepy, ordinary town it had once been. It was now a place where people came to be inspired, to remember that life held more possibilities than they had once believed. One evening, as Sarah walked through the town square, she noticed a mural being painted on one of the old brick walls. It was a vibrant scene, filled with colors and images that symbolized the people of Briarwood. The cafe, the community center, musical notes, paintbrushes, and even a small figure of a woman holding a microphone. At the center of it all was a quote in bold letters: "Your voice matters. Let it be heard." Sarah felt tears welling up as she took in the mural, realizing that her story had become part of something larger, something beautiful that belonged to everyone. She had set out to reclaim her own voice, but in doing so, she had ignited a collective spirit, a reminder that every person's story mattered, that each voice held the power to change lives. And as she stood there, bathed in the glow of the town she had helped transform, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She was no longer just a singer. She was a part of a community that had found its voice, a community that had learned to dream again. In that moment, she understood that her journey was far from over. It was only beginning, and she was ready to keep singing, to keep as Sarah stood before the mural, feeling the weight of everything that had unfolded since her first tentative steps on that stage months ago. She understood that her story, and the story of Briarwood, had become inseparable. The town she had once thought of as quiet and unremarkable had transformed into a place of resilience, courage, and collective spirit. And it was more than just her journey. It was a shared journey of every person who had dared to speak up, to express themselves, and to reclaim parts of their lives they had nearly forgotten. Over the following weeks, Sarah's life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and exciting. She continued to work at the cafe, where she greeted customers with a warmth that was returned with equal enthusiasm. Every morning, as she poured coffee and served pastries, she'd find herself in conversations with people who had been touched by the Voices of Briarwood movement. Some were new faces who had traveled from other towns, hoping to witness the community spirit that had become Briarwood's signature. Others were regulars who would stop by simply to thank her for what she had started, sharing stories of how their own lives had been impacted. But beyond these exchanges, a deeper sense of purpose had emerged in Sarah's life. She had become a mentor of sorts, a beacon for those struggling to find their own voices. She hosted regular workshops, not just in Briarwood, but in surrounding towns that had heard about her story and wanted to replicate the magic that had transformed her community. Each workshop was filled with laughter, tears, and moments of quiet reflection as people opened up, sharing talents and dreams they had buried long ago. One afternoon, Sarah received a call from a journalist from a well-known magazine who was writing an article on small towns revitalized by grassroots art movements. Intrigued by the story of Briarwood, the journalist wanted to interview Sarah and learn more about the inspiration behind Voices of Briarwood. Sarah hesitated at first, feeling the familiar twinge of self-doubt. She still thought of herself as an ordinary woman, a mother, a cafe worker, someone who had simply taken a chance. But Mr. Evans, who had become her constant supporter and friend, encouraged her to embrace the opportunity. "It's not just about you anymore, Sarah," he reminded her with a smile. "It's about the people who need to hear that they're not alone, that their voices matter." And so Sarah agreed. She met with the journalist in the cafe, and as they sipped coffee, she recounted the story of her journey, the years of silence, the moment of courage, and the outpouring of creativity that had followed. She spoke not just of her own struggles but of the people of Briarwood, of Grace the poet, Tom the painter, Evelyn the retired teacher, and the countless others who had found healing and connection through shared vulnerability. The article, titled "The Heartbeat of Briarwood: A Town Rediscovers Its Voice," was published a few weeks later. It painted a vivid picture of Briarwood's transformation, capturing the spirit of the town and the powerful impact of Voices of Briarwood. The story resonated with readers across the country, drawing attention and admiration from people who were inspired by the courage of ordinary individuals reclaiming their dreams. Soon, Sarah began receiving letters from people in faraway places, letters filled with gratitude, admiration, and personal stories. Strangers thanked her for reminding them that their voices mattered, that it was never too late to pursue something meaningful. One letter in particular stood out to Sarah. It was from a woman named Helen, who wrote that she had recently lost her husband and was struggling to find purpose in her life. Helen shared how reading about Sarah's journey had given her the courage to attend a local art class, something she had always wanted to do but had felt too afraid to pursue. "Your story gave me hope," Helen wrote, "and it reminded me that life can still be beautiful, even after loss." Sarah felt tears welling up as she read the letter. She realized that her story had taken on a life of its own, that it was now woven into the lives of people she would never meet, but who had been touched by the simple act of her finding her voice. It was humbling and surreal, a reminder of the immense power of vulnerability and authenticity. The story of Briarwood continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Inspired by Sarah's journey, a group of townspeople proposed building a small arts center in the town square, a place where people could come to create, learn, and connect. The project was ambitious, and at first, there was uncertainty about whether they would have the resources to make it a reality. But the people of Briarwood rallied together, organizing fundraisers, donation drives, and even a town-wide talent show to raise money for the center. Sarah was asked to be one of the main speakers at the event, and as she stood on stage in front of her community, she was overcome by a wave of gratitude and pride. She looked out at the faces of people who had become family to her, people who had supported her, believed in her, and grown with her. Her voice trembled with emotion as she spoke, thanking them for being a part of the journey, for daring to dream alongside her. The talent show was a resounding success, and by the end of the night, they had raised enough money to begin construction on the art center. The townspeople named it the Dreamer's Haven in honor of those who had rekindled their dreams within its walls. When the doors finally opened, it became a hub of creativity and connection, a place where anyone, regardless of age or background, could find a space to express themselves. Emma, now 17 and growing more confident by the day, joined Sarah in volunteering at the Dreamer's Haven, She took charge of organizing youth programs, helping young people explore their talents and passions. The once shy teenager had blossomed into a young woman with a deep sense of purpose and empathy, and she credited her mother's journey with helping her discover her own potential. One day, as they were cleaning up after a workshop, Emma turned to Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "Mom," she began, "do you think you would have ever done all of this if you hadn't sung at the talent show?" Sarah paused, considering the question. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think maybe it was meant to happen this way. Sometimes life gives us opportunities that we don't recognize at first, but when we're brave enough to take them, they lead us to places we never could have imagined." Emma nodded, a look of quiet understanding in her eyes. "I'm glad you did," she said softly. "You've helped so many people, including me." Sarah wrapped her arms around her daughter, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride and love. She realized that her journey had come full circle, that the voice she had reclaimed had not only given her a new purpose, but had also strengthened the bond she shared with her daughter. In finding herself, she had given Emma the courage to find herself too. As the years went by, the Dreamers' Haven became a beloved landmark in Briarwood, a symbol of resilience and hope. People from all walks of life continued to gather there, sharing stories, creating art, and supporting one another. The mural in the town square grew, with new images and quotes added each year, capturing the evolving spirit of the town and the voices that filled it. For Sarah, life settled into a beautiful rhythm. She continued to sing, not for fame or recognition, but for the sheer joy of it. She performed at community events, in neighboring towns, and even recorded a few more songs, though she always returned to Briarwood, to the place where her journey had begun. She had learned that her voice, once hidden and silenced, had the power to inspire, to connect, and to heal. One summer evening, as she sat on the porch with Emma, now a young woman with dreams of her own, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She realized that life's greatest rewards often came not from grand achievements or accolades, but from the simple act of being true to oneself. Her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to Briarwood, to the Dreamers' Haven, and to the countless people whose lives had been touched by the courage of one ordinary woman who had dared to sing. In that quiet moment, as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she had helped others find theirs. And she knew, deep in her heart, that her story, and the stories of those she had inspired, would continue to echo through Briarwood for generations to come, a testament to the power of dreams, resilience, and the enduring strength of community. As she sat there, hand in hand with her daughter, Sarah looked out over the town she had always called home. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered to herself, "I am exactly where I'm meant to be."